The Sun is an electrically powered
Our
star.
entire solar system is moving into an interstellar energy cloud. And this cloud is responsible for exciting the atmospheres of the planets, including the Earth, and particularly the Sun. And the reason why the sunspots are growing stronger and more frequent is because we're moving into this cloud. Most scientists, I think, will give you that it may well be the most active the Sun has been since the end of the last ice age. Since then, this is the wildest it has been.
Dr. Coonan, who's the BP scientist, as his deputy. BP is running the Department of Energy.
Habibullah Abdussamatov, head of space research at Pulkovo Astronomical Observatory in St. Petersburg, Russia, predicts that a little ice age could begin by 2014. His theory is that long-term variations in the amount of solar energy reaching Earth is the principal reason driving and defining the whole mechanism of climate change from global warming to glacial periods. He states that total solar irradiance is the primary factor causing climate variations on Earth, not carbon dioxide. He believes we are headed for a long period of low solar activity that could reduce the energy received by Earth, causing a cooling effect much like the period between 1645 and 1850. The Earth has spent much of its history moving from one ice age to another, separated by short periods of warm weather. An ice age is the norm, not the exception on this planet. These periods of warm weather are thought to be around 12,000 years. It seems that we may be nearing the end of one of those warm periods and a shift to a colder climate may be imminent. Some scientists speculate this cold period could last only 30 to 100 years. And others think it may last as much as 100,000 years. It could take decades for the climate to cool, but there are no guarantees that a small initial change could not happen in the near future that threatens our food production capability. Even if it took decades for the climate to become unbearable to us, our food production would have ceased long before then.
The political change is going to be really interesting to observe because there's this huge decentralization wave going through. At the same time, we have this major fiat currency degradation period. Also against a background of a planet that's going to be shifting into an ice age with possible new Arctic and Antarctic circles. Now, we have a continent that we call Antarctica, but let's call that continent Fred for the moment, and think of Antarctica as merely the opposite side of the Arctic. So if, for instance, the Arctic new North Pole, in that sense, the center of the Arctic Circle, had been shifted to Washington, D.C., then Antarctica would not, the continent Antarctica, Fred, would not be covered with ice. It wouldn't be opposite the North Pole. You'd have a South Pole that would be about 33 degrees below the equator and significantly above our current continent Fred that we call Antarctica. In any event, the point being that the weather patterns are shifting radically, whether it's weather wars, geoengineering, and or unknown crap from space, or a combination thereof, as well as the impact of the expanding planet and our shifting back from the sun in our drag around orbit. All of these things are going to cooperate to provide a very interesting background that appears to be moving most of the planet in towards some kind of rapid oscillation leading into an ice age. Now, let me note that the oscillations that we've seen in our weather over the past decade are going to continue to shrink. We've seen them shrink, and so you'd have extreme freezing weather one week, and then the next week you'd be into warmth. And so you're oscillating between hot and cold in a very short frequency time, whereas prior to this it might take several months to go from a winter-like condition into a spring-like condition. Now, the oscillations are becoming more frequent, and the frequency is higher and spiking higher, and the duration is shorter on these kind of things. But that's going to change, because what's going to happen is certain areas are going to bust out of that frequency pattern and are going to get locked into a particular longer pattern. Those places that get busted out of this high frequency, high shift thing and get locked into cold may end up being one of our new North Poles. We may end up with 3 or 4, may end up with 40. It's just a total guess at this point as to how many we'll have. Then they'll all consolidate down to 1. In the meantime, though, this may form a number of places that would be, as you would think of them, as potential candidates to become our new Arctic area, our new frozen north. And this freezing component may have glaciers form in rather odd places that are just happen to be magnetically sensitive and holding one of the fractured north poles at that particular point, bringing in some part of the new polar vortex. Polar vortex is not a new term. It goes back, it's an ancient term, actually refers to the ionosphere, and it tells you why things are cold up there. There's this vortex of magnetic force that brings down cold energy, if you will, from space. And this is why all those mastodons and guys got frozen with, the buttercup still in their mouths and food undigested in their throat and this kind of thing. They were flash frozen because the shift of a fractured pole created a new Arctic area right over them as the polar vortex was sucked down right on top of them. Anyway, so fun times coming relative to planet changes, and fun times coming relative to economics.
Let me step back, because it's very important to understand that I do have some anger over being deceived for 25 years by the powers that be. But I also understand that most people, including members of my own family, really never got the truth about the climate. It's certainly not available in the newspapers. It's certainly not available on TV. And we're certainly not hearing about it from the President of the United States, are we? Certainly not. So how can we expect anyone to think other than what we get told every day? Climategate. Who's heard of Climategate? Show of hands? Most of you, okay. Wait a minute. Most of you were on that side of the room. What's wrong with you people over here? Sir, I'm afraid you're going to have to move to this side of the room since you know about Climategate. Climategate was a series of 2 releases of emails from the WikiLeaks scandal and from other scandals, but most of the releases came from apparently some good people in the UK who hacked into the emails between the UN scientists who were putting all these charts and reports together. It looks like Rupert Murdoch's, one of his newspapers over there, had to shut down because it was reporters from that newspaper that did it. That hasn't been finalized, but that's the scuttlebutt at this point. But thank God they did. They told us exactly what we had suspected all along. The data had been falsified. The data had been manipulated, The data had been turned upside down when necessary, and it had been ignored when it was showing the opposite trend. When it showed that there was global cooling, when it showed that there was no growth in global temperature, they didn't put it in the report. Fraud, deception. That's what we read about in those reports. Well,
an extreme low in the solar minimum. And the question I have is that low that we saw a few years ago in the extreme low in the solar minimum, is that extreme low in the solar minimum predictive of the next low, another low in the solar minimum?
Yes, thank you very much. In fact, I had indicated to again, the top NASA solar physicist, it was about to start. It could be starting as early as 2008. In 2008, between the last solar cycle, 23 and 24, we had 100-year low sunspot numbers. You're exactly right. Is it indicative of what's coming? The answer is yes. According to 2011 prediction by NASA, by the U.S. Air Force, and the National Solar Observatory, a solar hibernation has in fact now begun. My research has finally been confirmed, ladies and gentlemen, and it's not good news. Yes, sir. This is the southern, or the tip of the Antarctica Peninsula. And yes, it does show on here. There's something called an Antarctic Circle, just like there's an Arctic Circle. This is so far away from the South Pole, it's not even in the Antarctic Circle. That shows you not only how big Antarctica is, but this is the area where most of the scientists go and the tourists go, because it's too darn cold and dangerous to go any closer to the South Pole, unless you're fully equipped and authorized by your country to do so. Whenever we saw all these reports of ice shelves breaking off and Antarctica getting warmer routinely, if you go back and look at the data, it was all about what was going on up here in the tip. If you go back and look at all the data from the rest of the continent, you find a very different story. We were deceived, we were misled all this time. It's a very different story.
Is that the Cape Horn? I can barely see on the top there. Is that the African Cape Horn? No.
That's South America. Magellan Strait. This area is so cold it dominates the entire southern hemisphere. The southern hemisphere routinely goes colder before the northern hemisphere. It's already been doing that for 30 years. The northern hemisphere is playing catch-up. Right. If you look back at the long history of the planet with ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland, for example, or deep sea cores, we analyze those cores and we can go back hundreds of thousands and millions of years and see what gases were present back then. As a result of that kind of analysis that's been going on for decades, we do know that CO2 levels have varied dramatically over the eons. Yes, they have. In fact, right now we are at the CO2 level that we usually see before a new ice age begins. And if you go back every ice age, you'll see the same story. When you get up in the high 300s, then you know you're close to a new ice age. If you go back and look at the ice cores. And there are people now, including Bob Felix, the author of Not by Fire but by Ice, who have been trying to say, much like I have, that not only is it going to get cold, but we're heading into a new ice age, period. We have been led to believe that mankind's CO2 is so much a factor in our climate and is the dominant factor in the atmosphere when it comes to climate change. That's what we've been led to believe. It's wrong. I've said that many times. Many other scientists are saying the same thing. How can we say that? Here's why. The greenhouse gases in our atmosphere make up 1% of the atmosphere. The rest is oxygen, nitrogen, radon. That's pretty much it. And then you get this little bitty 1% of all the gas in this room and outside that's greenhouse gas. Now, you take that little bitty sliver of the pot and you go look at that. What is it made of? What are the greenhouse gases? Of that little bitty sliver of 1%, 95% of that is water vapor. Who told us that, or who didn't tell us that water vapor was the most abundant greenhouse gas? We haven't been told that. Is the President and the EPA passing legislation to control water vapor? Why not? It makes up 95% of all greenhouse gases, and they aren't even mentioning it. It's just like the sun. They've had to put it aside because they didn't want to talk about it. What they wanted to talk about was CO2. Okay? Let's take that 95%, put it aside. That leaves you 5% of 1%. We're getting down to pretty small numbers now. Of that 5% of greenhouse gases, at least 80% of that is naturally produced. Mankind, and by the Department of Energy study, mankind's production of CO2 is 1/20th of the natural world's CO2. And ladies and gentlemen, we have no control whatsoever of most of the CO2 on this planet. Zero control. So you take that 5% of that 5% of that 1%, And ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with a number that is so incredibly small. Believe me, that's one of the reasons people like me and other scientists in our group feel that mankind is insignificant in its contribution to greenhouse gases, in its contribution to CO2. So the models, again, all the theories in the megatonnage of production of mankind's CO2 is still dwarfed by natural numbers. If you find a report that says Atlanta emits 10,000 tons of CO2 per year, you need to be concerned, because in the same general area of Atlanta, Mother Nature's emitting 20 times that. Again, Mother Nature puts out 20 times, and that's by the Department of Energy. I've read one study that says it's actually 40 times what mankind produces. So that makes that small number so small that it's insignificant. Proof on the atmospheric changes. This is the last 100 years. This is the UN's data. It comes from the Hadley Center and the East Anglia Climate Research Unit. It's called HADCRU. This is the last 100 years from 1814 to 2014. Temperatures are going up all right, but look what happened in the last 30 years. They peaked and they're dropping sharply. Ladies and gentlemen, you are living through one of the more unique geophysical, astronomical times in the history of mankind. That's the only good news.
Okay, well, tell us.
Because what comes from this is much colder. But let's go to the next chart, maybe. There we go. This is the last 30 years. The same chart, but the last 30 years. Here in 2007, it peaked. Global atmospheric temperatures. The oceans had already peaked 3 years earlier. We're going to show you that chart. But they've been dropping, and they're dropping even more rapidly now. Next chart. This is the last 30 years, from 79 to 2013, of the world's oceans. They've been declining for 10 years. Here's 2003 when it peaked. 10 years ago, and it's still dropping. It's dropping even further. We're down in here now. This line is dropping down. If you turn this curved line to a straight line function, you'll see no question. It's dropping and has been for 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, the oceans of the world have been declining, getting colder for 10 years. No one has told us about this because they're being quiet. They're keeping quiet. The atmospheric scientists, the climate scientists, and the solar physicists that I know are not telling us the truth. And this comes from the National Climate Center by NOAA, where they monitor this stuff. They know very well. The administrator of NOAA, Dr. Catherine Sullivan, an astronaut, I know her. She knows very well that the oceans have been cooling for 10 years. She knows very well that the Earth's atmosphere has been cooling for 7 years. And yet, yesterday she came out and supported the president on his statement about the climate. The president, on June the 25th in Georgetown University, said something unbelievable. He said that the global warming caused by man is accelerating. Unbelievable statement by the President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no global warming. There is no global warming.
I want all questions to be held until John gets to his
Okay, next chart. So, when is it coming and how bad is it going to be? This is my 206-year cycle mathematically interpreted on a chart done by a Serbian mathematician. His formula is as long as this slide, so I'm not going to put it up. But basically, here's where we were 200 years ago, the last time we had a solar hibernation. By definition, a solar hibernation occurs when you get 50 sunspots. We warmed up, we got cold. We warmed up, we got cold. Here's the year 2031, the decade of the 2030s. This is when it's going to be cold again. The relational cycle theory is a cold climate theory. It tells you when things are going to get cold, not when they're going to be warm. You have to back into that number. I mean, I can do that easily enough, but it tells you when things will be cold, because it tells you when the sun will go to a hibernation state. Once it's in hibernation, the earth always gets cold. When the earth gets cold, what happens to our crops? They die. Ladies and gentlemen, the last time this happened, in the 1800s, historian John D. Post called it the world's worst subsistence crisis in human history. We don't have a lot of historians from back then, not a lot of records were kept, but what we do know, and what historian John D. Post has found, is that people starved to death in untold numbers.
The shape of the galaxy shown here illustrates to some degree, in principle, the shape of the plasma environment in our solar system, though the density in the solar system is presently too low for the organizing plasma streams to be seen. However, by replicating the shaping process in the very small, in the laboratory environment, we can explore the forces that shape these types of phenomena. David Lapointe discovered in laboratory experiments that the primer fields, when they exist and are functioning, physically prime the environment of the solar system with a densely compressed sphere of plasma centered on our Sun. The principle is illustrated here. The effects, however, that David Lapointe discovered are so amazingly critical that great problems arise for humanity when their functioning is impeded or is collapsing. The evidence tells us that the dense plasma environment that is focused on the center of the solar system enables our Sun to be electrically powered from the outside by electric arc reactions. In these reactions, the condensed plasma interacts with the Sun's photosphere. The condensing process is a multi-stage process that is illustrated to some degree in the Red Square Nebula. The nebula is not the remnant of an exploding star as nebulas are often regarded. Instead, it is an example of the typical features of the primer fields in operation. The fields formed by the principles inherent in the flow of electric plasma in space. The details will be discussed later, though the overall effect is noteworthy here. The effect of the fields is that plasma streams that exist in galactic space in wide channels becomes drawn together like by a wide funnel and becomes magnetically focused from the funnel onto a central sun, or a system of multiple suns that become intensely powered by this process. The planets exist outside of this densely powered sphere, on an ecliptic centered on the Sun, between the two primer field structures. The plasma concentration process that we see in operation here, which is basically the same for every sun, renders our Sun as an intensely powered catalytic energy converter that is powered not from within, but is powered externally at its surface. The evidence that the Sun is externally powered is fairly obvious. When we look beneath the high-powered photosphere, through the open space at the umbra of the sunspots, the Sun reveals itself as being much darker and therefore cooler inside. The photosphere has been measured at a whopping 5,870 degrees Kelvin, and the surface, below at a mere 3,000 degrees. This means that the Sun's great brilliance is electrically generated at its very surface, and does not emanate from within from nuclear fusion reactions, as it is generally believed. It has become evident in lab experiments that when the input density of the plasma streams that feed into the system drops below a certain minimum threshold, the critical fields can no longer be maintained. They simply collapse, whereby the entire process stops. When this collapse happens in the real world, the brilliant photosphere of our Sun is no longer being powered. It becomes in effect turned off. It fades into a thin haze, leaving in the wake a colder, darker, yellow Sun that glows dimly by its internally stored up energy, like embers of a fire gone out, which too then slowly diminish. This means that the transition to the next ice age will not be a slow process that is drawn out over thousands of years, but will be a radical turn-off transition, in which the Sun grows dim in possibly a single day. There exists plenty of evidence in ice core samples that the kind of rapid transformation of the climate on Earth has happened that reflects an on-off transition from an active Sun to a deactivated Sun. Nothing short of such a radical transition can explain the massive, rapid cooling that occurred when the last ice age began 120,000 years ago. It takes a massive reduction in solar energy input into the Earth's climate to cause the formation of the enormous ice sheets that become spread across much of the northern hemisphere, as it is shown here, which piled up 10,000 feet thick, or more in some places. When the input plasma streams for the solar system diminish below the cutoff threshold, where the Sun turns off, a radically different world unfolds. The actual time frame in which the collapse of the climate follows may be extremely short, probably spanning less than a single year for all practical purposes. We are presently near the cutoff point. We have come to the end phase of the actively powered period of the Sun, and the beginning of the next 90,000-year glaciation period. Of course, we don't know the precise day or year at which the primer fields will collapse, and the plasmasphere around the Sun will vanish, but do we really need to know this? We know already enough to be inspired to take the appropriate actions to build new infrastructures for our food supply, and for our living. We know with measured evidence on hand that the Earth has been in a diminishing trend for 3,000 years already, that appears to be now accelerating towards the critical cutoff point. We know that over the time frame of a single decade, NASA's Ulysses spacecraft has measured the amazing weakening of the solar wind pressure by a whopping 30%. This is an enormous drop-off for such a short period. We also know that when the Sun's powered state ends, that is when it gets turned off to a lower intensity state, the big ice sheets will form. It takes a big change in the incoming energy that warms our planet for big effects to happen. Let's hope that the cutoff point that we are moving towards is still more distant in time than it appears to be, because at the present time no one of humanity is prepared for the consequences. Not the least preparations are even considered to be made, much less are made, even while the consequences, when they begin, promise to be far bigger than most people dare yet to imagine. Presently, the two very long climate cycles are both near their minimum point, whereby the weak plasma conditions have been created that have gripped the Earth for the last 2 million years, in which the ice ages happened. During these weak conditions that have been slowly developing for the last 5 million years, which are getting still weaker, the breakdown of the primer fields that power our solar system has become a regular occurrence during the weakest times. Then, when the plasma streams that flow through the solar system become so weak that they drop below a threshold, a point is reached when the pinch effect in the plasma streams is no longer strong enough to twist the plasma currents into knots to create the bolt-type magnetic structures with the void at the center that make up the primer fields. And so the primer fields do not form. What once existed suddenly exists no more. The plasma currents become no longer concentrated then, but simply flow through the solar system without becoming focused around the Sun. At this point the Sun simply turns off. It becomes inactive, dim, and cold. An ice age begins. The ice ages didn't last as long in the earlier phase of the weakening conditions. They lasted only 41,000 years then. As the general weakening continued, the 100,000 years long ice ages began. This became named the Pleistocene Epoch. Throughout the ice ages in which the primer fields fail, the Sun becomes inactive for long periods. It becomes a dim yellow star that glows mostly by its stored-up energy, and whatever nuclear decay may be ongoing within it. However, evidence exists that the Sun remains not totally shut down during the long ice age glaciation periods, which typically last 100,000 years. The Earth would turn into a snowball if the Sun would remain inactive for 100,000 years. Fortunately, this doesn't happen. Periodically short pulses of high-density conditions do occur during the ice ages, which reinvigorate the plasma streams that enable the primer fields to form anew, whereby the Sun becomes powered again. Unfortunately, these pulses are short in duration. The Sun remains powered by these pulses for only a few decades, and then turns off again. Evidence exists that these pulses occurred on a fairly regular basis. Their occurrence has created large climate oscillations. Evidence has been detected in ice core samples drilled from the Greenland ice sheets that these short periods, when the Sun becomes active again, have occurred in intervals of 1470 years. The resulting oscillations have been named the Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations. Evidence exists that the Sun will likely shed a major portion of its mass when its inactive state begins. It might eject as much as 30% of its mass. A Sun absorbs large amounts of mass in the form of plasma during its actively powered state. The accumulation of plasma, which carries an electric charge, creates an internal electric pressure. In the Sun, this internal pressure becomes released when the external high-pressure plasma environment around the Sun vanishes. Some evidence that this gigantic mass ejection happens is found in the orbits of the planets. At the present time, the planet's orbit had mere 71% of the velocity that a stable orbit requires. This means that the Sun's gravitational attraction is presently 29% stronger than the centrifugal force of the planets in orbit. The large difference is evidently compensated for by the electromagnetic effects of the primer fields that maintain the orbits against the stronger gravity. In a lab experiment, non-magnetic steel balls were laid on a sheet of glass. They were drawn into a specific orbit around the center of two bowl-shaped magnets. The steel balls seen here are magnetically self-spacing. If they are disturbed and let go, they return to their magnetically determined positions. The experiment illustrates to some degree how the orbits of the planets are assisted magnetically. But during the long off times during the ice ages, when the primer fields no longer exist, or exist only during the short periods of the Donskoy warming events, the Sun's gravity would then have to be much weaker than it is today for the orbits to remain intact. Without the weaker solar gravity, the orbits would collapse over time. The fact that the collapse of the orbits did not happen during the ice ages indicates that the Sun's gravity was lower during its inactive time, in which gravity alone determines the orbits of the planets, balanced against the centrifugal force generated by their orbital velocity. In order for stable orbits to be possible without magnetic existence, the Sun must have shed a large part of its mass, and its gravitational attraction with it may be up to 25%. This means that we will see enormously large mass ejections happening when the primer fields collapse that maintain presently a strong plasma pressure around the Sun, and thereby within the Sun. The plasma mass ejection will likely be strong at first when the external plasma pressure no longer exists. The Sun will then lose, probably quite rapidly, a large portion of the mass it has absorbed during the 12,000 years of its high-power conditions in the interglacial period. After the initial burst, the mass ejection will likely diminish exponentially over a span of several thousand years. During the early phase of the mass ejection, a large portion of the inner solar system will likely become enveloped within a cloud of plasma that will surely also affect the Earth, where it becomes absorbed in the crust and causes large electric stress fracturing or electric explosions that trigger earthquakes and also cause large earthquakes themselves. The result will likely be the kind of phenomenon that in the fusion Sun theory is referred to as the red giant stage of the Sun, that is deemed to result from perceived hydrogen depletion, which is said to enable the assumed helium fusion phase. In real terms, the red giant stage is merely a plasma mass ejection event that results when the input power streams diminish below the threshold level where the primer fields collapse. Some of the mass ejection events accumulate the ejected solar mass in large plasma fields that are termed planetary nebula. The more powerful mass ejection events may rip a portion of the Sun apart in extremely large electric stress explosions. These events are termed supernova events. In the fusion Sun theory, they are deemed to be star explosions. In the real universe, they are nothing more than just mass ejection events. For us, when the Sun's great mass ejection event begins in possibly 30 to 50 years from now, it won't be hugely cataclysmic in nature, no matter how large the event may appear from a distance, but it will result in major earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that we need to be prepared for. The Earth's magnetic field won't protect us then either, because it too will likely have collapsed by then, with the collapse of the primer fields. The only real cataclysmic event that happens typically among aging stars occurs when their accumulated mass becomes so great, especially during strong active periods, that the accumulation results in internal electric stress fracturing that breaks a Sun up into two or more fragments that then form a binary, triple, and quadruple star system. According to a survey, singular star systems, like our own, are actually a minority among stars. With our Sun being a mediocre star, However, it is extremely unlikely that any type of electric stress fracturing will occur in our Sun, including during the coming Ice Age transition. Nevertheless, we will see extremely large electric stress fracturing events occur on Earth, in the form of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, especially along the San Andreas Fault, that is extremely stressed already. We would want to be far away from this area and be safely afloat on the oceans by then. The Sun is presently charged with plasma, like a car tire is pumped up with air. When a car tire blows, its air bursts out. When the equivalent happens to the Sun, great showers of plasma will burst from it and hit the Earth and cause those electric stress explosions that trigger earthquakes at unprecedented magnitudes that we must prepare for before they happen. We have no historic records available of how large these events were that will happen again. The last transition to an ice age occurred 120,000 years ago, that only few may have survived. The general collapse is reflected in high rates of spiritual insanity. This period, that spans slightly more than half a century, coincides with the most tragic revival of the system of empire the world may have ever seen, which forged the revival of fascism, terror, economic destruction, and the grand looting of society, that is now culminating in mass genocide. The modern period of tragedy might be referred to someday as the pre-Ice Age period of insanity. It is here in this period where we find the dawn of the Cold War nuclear terrorism that has not yet ended, and the devolution of science that enabled the global warming terrorism to emerge for genocidal purposes. This is the current period that was marked by the banner being raised that declares that the Earth has cancer, and that this cancer is man. Under this banner the day industrial era was unleashed, in which ever more industries were dynamited and imports were brought into the West from slave-wage countries, which made up for the loss of production at home. On this path huge profits were stolen from society. This was the time when clever tricks for massive profiteering by deception began to reign, primarily in the financial markets, where no wealth for society is actually produced. This period also became the period of the rise of the depopulation ideology that blocked economic development on all fronts and gave rise to AIDS and, as of late, the mass burning of food and automobiles in a starving world. While the coincidence of the rise and fall in civilization with the rise and fall of cosmic ray density does not prove a causative connection of the two trends with empirical certainty, the trends are nevertheless interesting, because their coincidence suggests that we may experience a dramatically enriched spiritual and scientific environment in the coming Ice Age, when the cosmic ray flux is expected to dramatically increase once the Ice Age transition unfolds, which to some degree has already begun. This does not mean, however, that the state of our civilization and of human development as a whole is totally dependent on the conditions created by the changing cosmic ray flux. History has shown that humanity has the power, as human beings, to raise itself above the floor conditions that the cosmic ray flux sets up as a kind of default state. When society doesn't exercise the power of its humanity, it rides the default train, with all the consequences the changing terrain brings with it. However, when humanity empowers itself, which has been demonstrated on many occasions, it can achieve miracles that are completely uncharacteristic for the times. We will have to develop this process of self-empowerment as a precondition to meeting the Ice Age challenge. Before us, this challenge cannot be met with the current convention of riding the default train. The stepping away from this fate begins with the recognition that our sun would not be the brilliant life-giving fire in the sky without a dense plasmasphere surrounding it from which it draws its electric power that lights up its photosphere with electric plasma interaction. If this realization is made, half the battle is won, because everything follows, and the needed steps become logical. And this realization shouldn't be hard to make. It has been recognized a long time ago that our sun is not the steady-state nuclear fusion furnace, which it is widely said to be, but is powered by one of the vast networks of plasma streams that pervade the galaxies and the cosmos as a whole. Since plasma has mass, the plasma surrounding the sun becomes attracted by the sun's gravity and interacts with its outer atmosphere, the photosphere, which thereby becomes excited to 5,780 degrees Kelvin. It is that simple. The primer fields prime the environment in which the simple process unfolds for as long as the fields exist. Once you realize that this presently operating system will vanish in the near future, and that solutions are possible for humanity to move forward in spite of the dimmer sun, you may become inspired thereby to get out of the easy chair, to gain a fuller understanding of how the critical process operates on which your continued existence depends. The Ice Age transition will happen without fail. We can count on that. We are close to the transition to the next deep glaciation to begin, though we don't know how closes. We also know that the trend towards the next glaciation has been progressing for 3,000 years already, and is accelerating. We don't know exactly where the cutoff level is, beyond which the primer fields collapse, and the sun turns off. It may not be far below the level of the Little Ice Age. At the present trend, we may get to this point in 20, or 30 years, or 50 at the most. NASA's Ulysses spacecraft saw a 30% reduction in the solar wind pressure happening in just a single decade. That's not a small drop-off. And the trend is continuing. If our agriculture has not been transferred to the tropics before the high-power solar system stops, it's game over for humanity. Our hope lies not so much in the fact that the cosmic ray flux is increasing again, and that in time it will become the gold trim of the silver lining of the dark cloud of the coming Ice Age. With its dimmer Sunday, our hope lies in the power of our self-development, that builds on the riches that we have already won for ourselves as human beings. Nevertheless, the coming new Ice Age isn't something to cry over, but is rather something that's worth celebrating. We celebrate the closing of what may someday be called a spiritual lean period, in which we achieved wonders nevertheless. Let us celebrate that when the heliosphere vanishes that is presently created by our electrically powered sun, a new age for humanity may dawn that will be brighter in the things that really matter than anything that we have seen thus far. When the next Ice Age begins, we can expect to see a radical increase of the profound humanist developments to occur that have shaped us for the last 2 million years, which now, from a flying start, promise to be of a magnitude and quality which we cannot imagine as yet, provided we survive the present world long enough to get there and build the infrastructures that we require to live in this new world that we will build for ourselves for the coming Ice Age environment. Getting there also means that we must end the long epoch of empire, that we shut down its deepening cesspools, the terror projects of empire, the nuclear war buildup, and the monetarism that empire has forged that is collapsing the world. Getting there further means that we scrap the depopulation ideology that is championed by empire, that is wrecking the economies, that we banish the system of empire altogether, especially its fascism, that demands the wholesale burning of food in a starving world. Yes, in a physical sense, a winter is coming that promises to be harsh, but this winter promises to be rich in blessings that promise a new age of exciting potentials, and many more steps forward in the advance of civilization on all fronts, especially in science, spirituality, and Christian Science. Yes, the Ice Age transition before us comes with exciting potentials that stand before us as a powerful incentive for us to awake, to open our eyes, and to let go of the nightmarish dreams of empire and its shackles and chokeholds.
But what will happen in the next decades is still up in the air. Part of the science community believes that global warming is a man-made threat, but Dennis Avery of the Hudson Institute joins those predicting the next 20 to 30 years will actually bring cooler temperatures.
The Earth's temperatures have dropped an average of 0.6 of a degree Celsius in the last 2 years. The Pacific Ocean is telling us, as it has told us 10 times in the past 400 years, you're going to get cooler.
Avery points to a lack of sunspots as a predictor for lower temperatures, saying the effects of greenhouse gas warming have a small impact on climate change. In a speech last week, President-elect Obama called for the creation of a green energy economy. Still, others warn that no matter what you think about climate change, new policies would essentially have no effect.
There's very little we can do about it. Any effort to restrict the use of carbon dioxide is going to hurt us economically and have zero effect on the climate.
As Singer says, a lot of pain for no gain.
The National Oceanic and Atmospheric NOAA Administration has got some very good records on temperatures, average temperatures in the United States dating back to 1880. And here's what these numbers look like. You've all seen those, but to help us all, the audience, and most of all me to get through this, these show the warmest years on record. 1998, 2005, and 2006 rather, and 1934. 2008 was cooler, in fact the coolest since 1997. And it's intriguing to see that graph there. The graph that we're looking at showing some question that the warming trend may be just a snapshot in time. The global temperatures by NOAA are 7 of the 8 warmest years on record have occurred since 2001. The 10 warmest years have all occurred since 1995. So let me start, if I may, Joseph DeLeo. Your reaction to those numbers? Do you quibble with what they represent?
Yes, I do. In fact, if you look at the satellite data, which is the most reliable data, the best coverage of the globe, 2008 was the 14th coldest in 30 years. That doesn't jive with the 10th warmest on 159 years in the Hadley data set, or in 113 or 14 years in the NOAA data set. Those global data sets are contaminated by the fact that 2/3 of the globe's stations dropped out in 1990, most of them rural, and they performed no urban adjustment. And Lou, you know, your people in your studio know that if they live in the suburbs of New York City, it's a lot colder in rural areas than it is in the city. So now we have more urban effect in those numbers reflecting that show up in that enhanced or exaggerated warming in the global data sets.
Your thoughts on these numbers, because they are intriguing. They are a brief snapshot, admittedly, in comparison to the total extent of time we're talking about here. I guess we could go back 4.6 billion years. Let's keep it in the range of something like 500,000 years. What's your reaction to those numbers and your interpretation?
Well, Lou...
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Jay.
Lou, I'm in the camp with Joe and Fred Singer and Dennis Avery, and I think more importantly it is to look at the sun's output. And in recent years, we've seen very, very low sunspot activity, and we're definitely, in my mind, not only in a cooling period, we're going to be staying in it for a couple decades. And I see it as a major advantage. Although I think we will be able to adapt to it, I'm hopeful that this change in the sun's output will put some common sense into the legislature not to pass any dramatic cap and trade or carbon tax legislation that will set us in a far deeper economic hole. I believe Mr. Obama and his economic team are well placed to dig us out of this recession in the next 18 months to 2 years. But I think if we pass any dramatic legislation to reduce greenhouse gases, the recession is going to last quite a few more years, and we'll come out of it with a lower standard of living as a result on very tenuous scientific grounds.
You made the comment about the impact of solar sunspot activity. The 11-year cycle that we're all familiar with. There are much larger cycles that run out 12 to 13,000 years as well. And we also heard in Inez Ferre's report a disregard, if you will, for the strength and the significance of solar activity on the Earth's environment. How do you respond to that?
It just seems silly to not recognize that the Earth's climate is driven by the sun. Your Chad Myers, when we were on a month ago, pointed out that it's really arrogant for mankind to think he controls the climate of the universe. Only 4% of our greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide. 90% is water vapor, which we have no impact over. And if we were to try to reduce greenhouse gases, with China and India controlling way more than we do, and they've boldly said they're not going to cripple their economy by following suit, our impact would have no change in temperature at all.
In news.
Russian scientists say the Earth may be headed for a period of global cooling, and it could last 200 to 250 years. The Voice of Russia reports that belief comes from scientists at an observatory in St. Petersburg. They say the sun is heading into a cycle where it's less active, and that will affect different aspects of the climate on Earth. Over time, that will lead to cooler than average temperatures.
Joe Bastardi of Weather Bell joins us now for more. Joe, it was the coldest spring I can remember here in Virginia Beach. I am so tired of the cold. Please tell me we are not headed for global cooling.
Here in the United States, because the Pacific cools first and the Atlantic is still warm, we are still biased warmer than normal here for the next 5 to 7 years. And also this heightened sense of urgency along the eastern seaboard with hurricanes. This happened in the 1950s. You recall after the 1950s came the 60s and 70s, and people were thinking the Ice Age was coming then. So we are definitely, in my opinion, going to be continue the global cooling trend that began 4 years ago. We leveled off, and over the last 4 years, we've actually fallen off about 0.05 Celsius from where we were at the beginning of the millennium.
Well, Joe, why do so many people still hold to global warming, that we're experiencing global warming?
You can make anything out of anything you want. You have to look at the long-term ideas, and you also have to understand what the atmosphere is capable of doing. And believe me, it's capable of doing a lot more than what we've seen here over the last 10 to 15 years.
Well, let me ask you this. What would be the implications of global cooling if it really does happen?
Oh, that's far worse than global warming. Look, the fact of the matter is things grow better when there's more carbon dioxide in the air, though I don't think carbon dioxide, I think carbon dioxide adds 0.4 to 0.7 degrees Celsius to the entire 33 Celsius that the greenhouse gases add, which we need for life on the planet. You got to understand, if there were no greenhouse gases, the Earth's temperature would be minus 18 Celsius. That's not a fun temperature to live at. But I think that it takes more energy to cool things. It's tougher to grow things. Look what's going on in the Central Plains, having the coldest spring ever. You can't get out there to plant your crops. So they're about to have another big snowstorm in Iowa and parts of Missouri and Minnesota. And yeah, even though it's 85, 90 degrees today, in 4 days it's going to be snowing. So the implications of colder are much worse than warmer. Think about it. More people live closer to the equator than they do to the poles.
Yes, and I think they are very smart to do that. Well, I certainly hope we have the warm weather coming soon. Joe Bastardi, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, and enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you've got.
Great advice.